The city of Rome during the Pax Romana was populated by about 1 million people. The population of this city was sustained by a vast network of ships and storehouses that brought and stored grain from distant parts of the Roman Empire. The Roman state orchestrated a colossal program of grain procurement, shipping, and distribution called the Annona. And the Annona was a feat unmatched in the pre-industrial world. There was nothing like it ever before. A wonder of the ancient world that did not leave behind a monument, but was nevertheless monumental. But there may have also been some downsides to this system. Rural farmers in the countryside had their harvests taken from them. Urban masses became dependent upon handouts from the state. Political ambition and greed, as ever, soured the system. On today's episode, I'm answering a listener question which explores the complex machine that kept Romans alive. Was Rome's grain dole a benefit or a burden? Question and Answers, Episode 7. Was Rome's grain dole a benefit or a burden? Before we get to today's episode, I just want to mention that I've dropped a lengthy YouTube video answering the question, why did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon? It's an excerpt from one of my Roman history lectures at Indiana University, and you can get that 45-minute video on YouTube on my channel. Look for me, Prof. CPE. You can also type in my name, Colin Elliott, or you can just type in the question that the video answers, why did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon? So go ahead and check out that video, and feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel while you're at it. All right, let's get to today's episode. The Roman grain dole, called the Annona, was a state-managed program to supply grain and later was expanded to include things like bread, oil, wine, and pork to the city of Rome, but also its armies and some additional cities. It served several 100,000 Roman citizens and was sustained throughout the period of the Pax Romana and a little bit before and a little bit after as well. The program originated in the middle of the Roman Republic, originally instituted by the populist politician Gaius Gracchus in 123 BC as a grain subsidy, and then eventually made into a free grain program in the 50s BC. And like many government programs, once it got started, it was essentially impossible to get rid of. Both Julius Caesar and the Roman Emperor Augustus placed some limits on who could receive the free grain, but otherwise the system remained intact for the vast majority of the history of the Roman Empire. The idea here was to ensure food stability for Rome's 1 million inhabitants, but did it actually work? Was the Annona helpful in terms of alleviating hunger, stabilizing society? Or was it harmful? Did it distort markets? Did it exacerbate inequality? Did it weaken the rural Roman economy? Well, I'll tell you right up front what my view is. I think the Annona was a monumental logistical achievement, and at times it truly mitigated urban food insecurity in the city of Rome. At the same time, it was inefficient. There were political problems with this system, and it was also exploitative. In the end, I think this system was probably more harmful than good, especially to the Roman countryside, and I think it had some long-term unintended consequences that are worth exploring in full. So let's go ahead and get to it. First, I want to start with what some of the helpful aspects of the grain dole system were. First of all, did it mitigate urban food insecurity? Superficially, yes. The Roman grain dole provided around 32 kilograms, or what the Romans would call around 5 modii of grain every month to about 200,000, give or take, eligible male Roman citizens. That amount of grain, 32 kilograms a month, is sufficient to feed not only one male adult, but also a dependent as well, a wife, a child, maybe even a little more than that. And so even though around 200,000 citizens were eligible, really probably 300 to 400,000 Romans actually ate the free grain. Having regular access to grain would have reduced malnutrition in the city of Rome. It would have decreased the risk of starvation, especially for the urban poor, and particularly during long crises, because it drew on state-controlled grain stores. The social dynamics in the city of Rome were volatile, and hunger was a pervasive problem, and so the grain dole could be used in times of crisis to alleviate famines, provided that there was grain available in Rome's storehouses. The Roman grain dole was also an impressive logistical achievement. If you think about it, the grain that fed the city of Rome came from some of the far-flung provinces of the Roman Empire, Egypt, North Africa, and then closer to home in Sicily and Sardinia. The amount of grain needed to feed Rome's population was well over 200,000 to maybe 300,000 tons of grain annually. To get all of this grain over to Rome, Roman emperors had to use several ports and mobilize resources to keep these ports running and even improved. Ports like Ostia, Portus, and the port at Alexandria, where the grain departed Egypt. Hundreds, maybe thousands of merchants took voyages annually with ships, some carrying 65 tons of grain, but some ships appear to have been able to carry several hundred tons of grain. These ships navigated a fairly predictable Mediterranean route, first from Italy to Alexandria, which was a relatively straight shot, about a 2-week journey, but the return journey was much more difficult due to contrary winds and the need to stay near the coast. So to get from Alexandria, for example, in Egypt, all the way to one of the Italian ports took probably 2 months, maybe in some cases 3 months, depending on how many stops and what the weather was like and all of those things. Pliny the Younger, who was the Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor under the Emperor Trajan, praised the logistical achievement of the Annona. This is what he wrote, quote, "We are blessed with a prince who could switch earth's bounty here and there as occasion and necessity require, bringing aid and nourishment to a nation cut off by the sea as if its people were numbered among the humbler citizens of Rome. He can so join east and west by convoys that those people who offer and those who need supplies can learn and appreciate in their turn, after experiencing license and discord, how much they gain from having one master to serve. Divide a common property, and each individual must bear his own losses. But where everything is jointly held, no one suffers personal loss, and all share in the common wealth." That's Pliny the Elder in his panegyric to the Emperor Trajan. What is he saying? The Annona was a logistical success from Pliny's perspective as a member of the Roman elite. Now, Pliny credits Trajan himself with managing the Roman grain supply. That's not exactly how it worked. Rather, the emperors appointed a praefectus Annonae, an imperial official in charge of the grain supply, and it was his job to implement imperial policy that made the grain supply happen. What did this look like during the Pax Romana? Well, the prefect could offer subsidies to make the transport of grain cheaper for those who shipped it. After all, grain was nowhere near as profitable to ship as luxury goods that came from Egypt. The prefect would also offer tax exemptions, and we know that such exemptions were given under the Roman emperors. Finally, a kind of state-sponsored insurance was given to ship owners, especially those who captained the largest grain ships. This occurred under Claudius. The insurance program provided a backstop in case storms or some other kind of event led to a disruption or a loss of a captain's grain shipment. The state would pay for any losses. And this incentivized even more private merchants to invest their resources in the Annona system. All of these legal protections provided support to private merchants and enabled them to meet the needs of the Roman state. The last benefit that I'll mention of the Roman grain system is a social one. For the Romans, this system was not merely about providing grain. It was not simply a welfare program meant to, say, alleviate hunger. It was not purely a social program. Eligibility for the grain dole was a mark of citizenship. It was restricted to citizens. Therefore, it came with a degree of status. Having the right to take free grain in the city marked one off as privileged against non-citizens, slaves, and even women and children. The grain dole was also hereditary. The men that received free grain could do so because their father or their grandfather or other distant male ancestors had been Roman citizens. And so the grain dole reinforced civic identity and loyalty to the Roman state. Participating in the grain dole was not merely an act of receiving food. It was a way to participate in the government and lend it legitimacy. Very different in some ways than modern welfare programs, which in many countries still carry a kind of social stigma with them. One doesn't always want somebody else to know that they receive help from the state. In Rome, the opposite was true. A Roman man would have been proud of the chit that he carried every month to the distribution location to receive grain. He was proud to do so. It reinforced his Romanness. And in a time and place where there was very little to distinguish one poor person from another poor person, that status mattered. So those are some of the benefits of the Roman Annona system. But an economic analysis of the Annona system reveals some deficiencies. First, the fact the state provided so much of the grain that went to Rome would have distorted markets. It prioritized urban needs and it inflated prices in Rome and would have encouraged speculation by elites and also merchants. Grain provided by the market had the benefit of bringing profit to both the giver and the receiver. The reason the grain merchant sold the grain was because he wanted money more than the grain, and the reason the grain purchaser bought the grain was because he wanted grain more than the money. And so when the exchange happened, everybody was happy. We see this today whenever a person purchases something at the store and both people say thank you. That double thank you is a small reminder that market activity tends to benefit everybody. The Roman Annona, however, was a zero-sum game. It took from some people in the Roman Empire and it gave to others. And it did this through force. And as a result, some people benefited while other people did not. The large shippers, for example, that received subsidies or tax breaks or insurance may have done very well, but smaller merchants were intrinsically disadvantaged, and this stifled competition in the grain market. Roman elites, including emperors, simply did not understand economics. They didn't understand the dynamics of markets. They also did not have complete economic knowledge. Nobody does. And so their zero-sum decisions to benefit one person or group and disadvantage other people or groups will have led to inefficiencies, mismanagement, and ultimately exacerbation of various bottlenecks in the supply chain. So under the Roman system, for example, the provinces that had the most grain, particularly Egypt and Africa, often suffered the most problems with hunger, especially in rural parts of the Roman Empire. How do we know this happened? Well, because the Roman physician Galen vividly described the impact of grain expropriations on the countryside when he was touring Asia Minor as a teenager in the middle of the 2nd century AD. This is what he said, quote, "People living in towns, by taking from the countryside all the wheat, along with the barley and the beans and the lentils, left for the countrymen all the other grains, which they call pulses and legumes. They then eat twigs and shoots of the trees and bushes and bulbs and roots of plants with bad juices, and consume wild greens, whatever happens to be in good supply, without sparing until they are satisfied, just as they boiled and ate whole green grasses, which they had never tasted even to try them. So the very people that were producing some of the grain that fed Rome were not able to share of the fruits of their own labor, promoting suffering and even malnutrition. So while Romans were fed grain from the country, the inhabitants of the country had to scrounge about for roots and grass and twigs, and as a result, found their health weakened and their resilience in jeopardy. When you combine grain expropriation with the broader notion of taxation, we can imagine that peasants were not only malnourished and underfed, but may very well have found themselves in debt, losing their lands, needing to migrate to cities, and then in turn increasing the demand in those cities for free grain itself. So in an indirect way and over the long term, providing free grain in the cities would have made starvation overall a little bit more likely, undermining the empire's agricultural base and creating a cycle of dependency. I mentioned earlier that the grain dole brought status benefits, but there were also some drawbacks here as well. The fact that a Roman citizen could expect grain created a sense of entitlement, and this sense of entitlement could be manipulated by politicians and eventually emperors. It was simply taken for granted that an emperor's job was to provide food for the population. And as a result, it was expected that Roman citizens rely on the emperor and other patrons, and of course the state, for their food, incentivizing passivity. And this was generally a bad deal because while the grain distributions at times were able to alleviate crises, they couldn't always do this. The Christian author Eusebius mentions a 3rd century plague and famine in which, quote, beggars overwhelmed the cities, but the harsh and hard-hearted wealthy refused to provide more than basic relief to the suffering. Finally, there were some logistical problems that the Annona system simply could not overcome, and which, over time, placed enough strain on the system to produce major failures. The Mediterranean is not safe for sailing the entire year, at least for the types of ships that sailed during the Roman period. Between May and September, or if the year was particularly good, between April and October, there was very little problem sailing the Mediterranean. Captains of grain ships could easily make the long journey from, say, Alexandria all the way to Italy. In the winter, the situation was a little bit different. Now, historians have debated this question. How bad were the storms and the general poor weather from, say, November to March? Was the Mediterranean, for example, closed entirely to shipments? Well, probably not, but it was a riskier time. And during particularly bad winter seasons or long winter seasons, grain shipments would be delayed. And if storehouses ran out in Rome and other cities, the entitled, dependent populations began to suffer and eventually to revolt. But it wasn't just the weather that delayed grain shipments for the Roman state. There were all sorts of rules that the state imposed in order to regulate numerous aspects of the grain procurement and shipment and distribution process. How do we know this? Well, we have a letter from a man who was on a grain ship, and he mentions the routine delays as a ship full of Alexandrian grain just sat in the harbor for almost a month. This is what his letter says, and I've changed the dates that he gives, which are in Egyptian months, into dates in the modern calendar, so you can understand just how long all of this took. I wish you to know that I reached land on June 30th. We unloaded our cargo on July 12th. I went up to Rome on July 19th. The place welcomed us as the god willed, and we are awaiting our discharge. So far, up to today, August 2nd, nobody in the grain fleet has been released. That is a letter from a crewman, also known as Papyrus BGU 127. That letter shows that it took over a month and counting for the ship to arrive, unload its grain, and then get discharged. What does this show? Well, had the state not had a highly regulated process in which there were various queues and inspections and limitations on dock workers and a variety of other inefficiencies, that ship may have been able to make multiple trips in a single sailing season, vastly increasing the supply of grain in the city of Rome. So while the Annona provided immediate relief for urban citizens in times of crisis, the costs of this system, both for grain itself, but also for the wider Roman economy, gradually accumulated and compounded over time. The exploitation of rural provinces weakened the empire's agricultural foundation, and market distortions reduced economic resilience, adding fractures and stresses in the economic system that would eventually boil over into crisis by the time we get to the late 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Around that time, the city of Rome could no longer sustain grain shipments from Egypt and had to switch and procure grain from closer provinces, Africa and Sicily. But even then, the system could not last. As Rome dealt with invasions from Northern Europe and the Eurasian steppe in the 4th and 5th century, Rome's grain supply in Africa was eventually cut off. As a result, the population of the city declined from about 1 million people in the middle of the 2nd century to perhaps between 30 and 60,000 by the 5th century AD. So, was this system a remarkable achievement? Yes. Did it feed hundreds of thousands of Romans in the capital? Yes. Did it at times prevent famine? Absolutely. At the same time, the costs of this system were steep. It gradually drained rural communities and built in inefficiencies to a monopolistic system. Its short-term benefits were clear, but its long-term consequences were part of a fatal mixture of systemic failures that ultimately and over time weakened the Roman Empire.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.